In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where perfectly trimmed lawns and white picket fences were the norm, life seemed peaceful for Mark and Sarah Thompson. Their home was nestled on a tree-lined street, surrounded by families who prided themselves on maintaining the pristine appearance of their community. The neighborhood was governed by a strict homeowners association, HOA, which enforced rules about everything from mailbox colors to how long cars could be parked in driveways. For most residents, these guidelines were just part of living in such an orderly place. But for Mark and Sarah, keeping up appearances came with its own set of challenges. Mark was an easygoing IT specialist who spent his weekends tinkering with gadgets or fixing things around the house. He preferred staying out of drama, focusing instead on making sure their property met the HOA's high standards. Sarah, on the other hand, appeared to be your typical stay-at-home mom, attending PTA meetings, baking cookies for school fundraisers, and volunteering at the local library. What no one knew, however, was that beneath her calm exterior lay years of intense military training. Sarah wasn't just any soldier. She was an active member of Delta Force, one of the most elite units in the U.S. Army. Her deployments were frequent, but always shrouded in secrecy, disguised as business trips to avoid drawing attention. The couple had moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago, seeking a safe and stable environment. At first, things went smoothly. They followed all the HOA rules, paid their dues on time, and kept their yard immaculate. But over time, tensions began to rise among some of the more obsessive neighbors. Mr. Harold Jenkins, a retired security guard with a booming voice and an insatiable need for control, took it upon himself to police everyone else's behavior. Whether it was someone leaving a trash can out overnight or planting flowers that didn't match the approved palette, Jenkins made sure every infraction was reported to the HOA. Sarah often found herself biting her tongue whenever Jenkins stopped by to lecture them about minor issues. She understood the importance of following rules, especially in a shared community, but she couldn't help feeling frustrated by the pettiness of it all. Still, she never let it show. To her neighbors, she was the picture of patience and cooperation. Only Mark knew the truth, that Sarah's calm demeanor masked a razor-sharp mind and skills honed through years of service. He sometimes joked that if anyone ever tried to push her too far, they'd regret it instantly. Little did he know how true those words would turn out to be. Despite the growing tension, Mark and Sarah tried to keep their heads down and avoid conflict. They valued their privacy and didn't want to attract unnecessary attention. But even the most careful people can't anticipate when trouble will come knocking. And soon enough, a seemingly harmless mistake would bring the simmering tensions to a boiling point, thrusting the Thompsons into a situation neither of them saw coming. It was a bright and uneventful afternoon when Sarah returned home from running errands. The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays over the neatly manicured lawns of the neighborhood. She had spent the morning picking up groceries, stopping by the dry cleaners, and grabbing a few supplies for Mark's latest DIY project, a wooden bench he wanted to build for their backyard. As she pulled into the driveway, her mind was focused on sorting through the bags and starting dinner later that evening. But something was slightly off. In her haste to avoid hitting a squirrel darting across the street, Sarah had parked her car at a slight angle in the driveway. It wasn't blocking anything. There was still plenty of room for pedestrians and vehicles to pass. But it wasn't perfectly aligned either. To anyone else, this might have gone unnoticed. However, in a neighborhood where every detail seemed to matter more than it should, even the smallest imperfection could draw unwanted attention. Sure enough, Mr. Harold Jenkins happened to glance out his window just as Sarah stepped out of the car. His eyes narrowed behind his thick glasses as he scrutinized the scene. Jenkins lived 2 houses down and had made it his personal mission to ensure everyone adhered to the HOA's strict guidelines. He didn't care if you were polite, hardworking, or kind-hearted. If your trash bins weren't tucked away properly or your holiday decorations stayed up too long, he would report you without hesitation. And today, Sarah's slightly crooked parking job was enough to set him off. Jenkins muttered under his breath as he picked up his phone, dialing the number for the HOA patrol service. "This has got to stop," he said aloud, though no one was around to hear him. Within minutes, a black SUV with the HOA logo emblazoned on its side rolled up to the Thompsons' house. Two officers emerged, wearing uniforms that gave them an air of authority despite being little more than glorified security guards hired by the association. Sarah, who was busy unloading grocery bags, looked up in surprise as the men approached. One of them, a tall man with a clipboard, began explaining the situation in a tone that bordered on condescending. "Ma'am, we've received reports that your vehicle is improperly parked. This violates Section 3.2 of the HOA guidelines." Sarah blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the absurdity of the complaint. She set down the bag of apples she'd been carrying and offered a polite smile. "I'm sorry about that," she said calmly. "I'll move it right now. It won't take a second." But instead of accepting her explanation, the officer pressed further. "We need you to sign this citation first," he insisted, holding out a piece of paper. Sarah frowned, sensing the situation escalating unnecessarily. "Look, I understand the rules, but there's really no harm done here. Let me just fix it, and we can all move on." The second officer, shorter and stockier, chimed in, his voice tinged with irritation. "Ma'am, refusing to comply with HOA regulations is unacceptable. You're setting a bad example for the community." Sarah felt her patience waning but kept her composure. She knew better than to let frustration get the best of her. Still, she couldn't help wondering how things had spiraled so quickly over something so trivial. Just moments ago, she had been thinking about what to cook for dinner. Now she found herself standing in her driveway, arguing with two strangers who seemed determined to make a mountain out of a molehill. As the conversation grew tenser, neither side willing to back down, the atmosphere shifted. What started as a minor issue was rapidly turning into something much bigger, and far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. The tension in the driveway was palpable as Sarah stood facing the two HOA officers. Her calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. The shorter officer, who had been growing increasingly agitated by her refusal to sign the citation, suddenly reached for his holster. In one swift motion, he pulled out a handgun and pointed it at Sarah. "Ma'am, don't make any sudden moves," he barked, his voice shaking slightly. His partner froze, looking just as stunned by the escalation as Sarah did. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The quiet suburban street, usually filled with the sounds of birds chirping and children playing, fell eerily silent. Sarah's military training kicked in immediately. Years of high-stakes missions and life-or-death scenarios had taught her how to remain composed under pressure. She didn't flinch or raise her voice. Instead, she locked eyes with the officer, her expression unreadable yet firm. Inside, her mind was racing. She assessed the situation in seconds: the officer's shaky grip on the weapon, his nervous posture, and the fact that his partner clearly hadn't expected things to escalate this far. Mark, who had been inside working on his laptop, heard the commotion from the living room. He rushed outside, his heart pounding as he took in the scene. There was his wife, standing calmly despite having a gun pointed at her, while two HOA officers looked like they'd bitten off more than they could chew. "What's going on here?" Mark demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The officer with the gun hesitated, glancing between Sarah and Mark. "Sir, stay back," he shouted, though his confidence seemed to falter. Sarah seized the opportunity to speak, her tone measured but commanding. "Officer, I understand you're trying to do your job, but pointing a firearm at someone over a parking violation is not only excessive, it's illegal." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The officer tightened his grip on the gun, sweat beading on his forehead. He tried to justify his actions, stammering about feeling threatened by Sarah's refusal to comply. But even as he spoke, it was clear he was losing control of the situation. His partner stepped forward cautiously, placing a hand on his arm. "Hey, Maybe we should just. No, the first officer snapped, cutting him off. Then, almost as if realizing how absurd the entire scene had become, he lowered the gun slightly. His face flushed red with embarrassment and frustration. The second officer shot him a look that screamed asterisk. "What are you doing?" asterisk before turning back to Sarah. "I'm sorry, Mom," the second officer said quickly, trying to defuse the situation. "We didn't mean for this to happen. Let's all just calm down." But the damage was done. The sight of a loaded weapon being drawn over something as trivial as a crookedly parked car had left everyone shaken, including the officers themselves. Sarah didn't move. Her gaze remained steady, never breaking contact with the man holding the gun. She knew better than to let her guard down until the threat was completely neutralized. "I'll say it again," she said firmly. "You need to put the weapon away. Now." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer slowly holstered the gun. He avoided making eye contact with anyone, his earlier bravado replaced by shame and uncertainty. His partner mumbled another apology before both men retreated to their SUV, leaving the Thompsons standing in stunned silence. As the vehicle sped away, Mark turned to Sarah, his face pale. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, exhaling deeply. For the first time since the encounter began, she allowed herself a flicker of emotion, a mix of relief and disbelief. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the HOA patrol SUV disappeared down the street, Mark turned to Sarah, his face a mixture of shock and awe. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah didn't answer right away. She stood still for a moment, her mind processing the absurdity of the situation. Then, with a deep breath, she turned to her husband and said, "Let me handle this." Mark nodded, trusting her completely, though he couldn't shake the image of the officer pulling a gun on his wife over something as trivial as a parking violation. It was surreal, almost unbelievable. But Sarah's calm demeanor reassured him. Whatever came next, he knew she had it under control. Sarah walked back into the house, grabbed her military ID, and returned to the driveway. She knew the officers might come back, or worse, call for backup, and she wanted to be prepared. If they thought they could intimidate her, they were about to learn how wrong they were. Moments later, true to her prediction, the black SUV reappeared. This time, both officers stepped out cautiously, their body language far less confrontational than before. "Ma'am," the second officer began, his tone apologetic, "we're here to resolve this peacefully. We don't want any trouble." Sarah crossed her arms and fixed them with a steady gaze. "Neither do I," she replied evenly. "But I need to make something clear. You pointed a firearm at me, an active-duty member of the U.S. Army Delta Force, over a minor issue that could have been resolved with a simple conversation. That's not acceptable." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The first officer, the one who had drawn his weapon, looked like he wanted to sink into the ground. His partner spoke up again, trying to smooth things over. "We understand now that we overstepped. It won't happen again." Sarah wasn't satisfied yet. She held up her military ID, letting the badge catch the sunlight. "Do you know what this means?" she asked, her voice firm but controlled. Both men shook their heads, clearly unsure. "It means I've been trained to handle threats far greater than anything you'll ever encounter in this neighborhood. And if you think pointing a gun at someone is going to scare me, you're mistaken." The officers stared at her, dumbfounded. They had no idea who they were dealing with when they arrived at the Thompsons' house. To them, Sarah had seemed like just another suburban mom, a woman who wouldn't dare stand up to authority. Now, faced with the reality of her background, they looked terrified. Their bravado from earlier had vanished entirely. "I'm not interested in making this personal," Sarah continued, softening her tone slightly. "But I am going to report this incident. Drawing a weapon without cause is serious, and I expect the HOA to take responsibility for your actions." Her words weren't delivered with anger or malice. but with the authority of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. The first officer finally found his voice. "Ma'am, please, we didn't mean for this to go so far. We're sorry." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you're sorry now. But an apology isn't enough. I suggest you inform your superiors about what happened today. Otherwise, I will." With nothing left to say, the officers climbed back into their SUV and drove off, leaving the Thompsons alone once again. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Mark let out a low whistle. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "You really showed them." Sarah managed a small smile, though there was still a weight on her shoulders. "I didn't want it to come to this," she admitted. "But people need to understand that power doesn't give you the right to abuse others. Not here, not anywhere." Word of the encounter spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some residents were skeptical at first, dismissing it as gossip. But when Mr. Jenkins himself confirmed the story, albeit reluctantly, the entire community was abuzz. Neighbors who had previously dismissed Sarah as quiet and reserved now looked at her with a newfound respect. Meanwhile, the HOA board scrambled to contain the fallout, knowing full well that this incident would cast a long shadow over their reputation. For Sarah, however, the fight was only beginning. The day after the incident, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers and speculation. Word of what had happened spread like wildfire, fueled by Mr. Harold Jenkins, who couldn't resist recounting the story to anyone who would listen. At first, many residents were skeptical. A Delta Force operative living among them. It sounded too dramatic to be true. But as details emerged, and Jenkins' account was corroborated by others who had witnessed parts of the confrontation, doubts turned into astonishment. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that evening to address the fallout. The community center was packed with neighbors eager to hear what had transpired and how the association planned to respond. Tensions ran high. Some attendees defended the actions of the HOA patrol officers, insisting they were just doing their jobs. Others sided firmly with Sarah, criticizing the HOA's overreach and demanding accountability for the officer who had drawn his weapon. When the meeting began, the board president, Mrs. Donna Fletcher, took the stage. She was a soft-spoken woman known for her diplomatic approach, but tonight she looked visibly uneasy. After a brief introduction, she opened the floor for comments. That's when all hell broke loose. One neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Lewis, stood up and addressed the room. "I've lived here for 12 years, and I've never seen anything this ridiculous," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're talking about a parking violation. How does that justify pointing a gun at someone? This isn't about rules anymore. It's about common sense." Her words drew murmurs of agreement from several attendees. Another resident, Mr. Alan Carter, chimed in. "I'm not saying we shouldn't have guidelines, but this has gone too far. If we keep letting these patrols act like they're above the law, no one will feel safe here." On the other side of the debate, a few residents argued that the HOA needed to maintain order. "Rules exist for a reason," said Mr. Greg Myers, a staunch supporter of strict enforcement. "If we start bending them every time someone complains, our neighborhood will fall apart." Amidst the heated back and forth, Sarah and Mark arrived late, slipping quietly into seats near the back. They hadn't planned to attend, but curiosity and a desire to ensure their voices were heard had brought them there. As the arguments grew louder, Sarah leaned over to whisper to Mark, "This is getting out of hand." Finally, Mrs. Fletcher intervened, calling for calm. "Let's focus on solutions," she urged. "We need to figure out how to move forward in a way that works for everyone." With that, she invited Sarah to speak. Though hesitant at first, Sarah rose from her seat and walked to the front of the room, her presence commanding immediate silence. "Thank you," she began, her tone steady and measured. "I didn't come here to point fingers or cause trouble. I came because I believe in this community. But I also believe in fairness. What happened yesterday wasn't just about a parking violation. It was about respect. Respect for each other and respect for the law." She went on to explain the dangers of escalating minor issues into major conflicts, emphasizing the importance of training and accountability for anyone wielding authority. Her words struck a chord with many in the audience, who nodded in agreement. Even some of the HOA's staunchest supporters seemed swayed by her perspective. By the end of the meeting, the board agreed to suspend the private HOA patrol service, pending a thorough review of its policies and practices. They also promised to implement stricter hiring standards and mandatory de-escalation training for future hires. While not everyone left satisfied, most felt it was a step in the right direction. As Sarah and Mark walked home that night, Mark glanced at his wife and smiled. "You handled that perfectly," he said. Sarah shrugged, though there was a hint of pride in her eyes. "It's not about me," she replied. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen again, to anyone." And with that, the first chapter of change in their neighborhood began. The incident with the HOA patrol officers quickly became the talk of the neighborhood and beyond. News outlets picked up the story, turning it into a local sensation. Headlines like "Delta Force Mom stands up to overzealous HOA patrol," and "When authority goes too far." A suburban showdown dominated social media feeds. People were fascinated by Sarah's calm, yet commanding response to a situation that could have easily spiraled out of control. Her background as an active Delta Force operative added a layer of intrigue, making her seem almost larger than life to those who had only known her as the quiet mom next door. As the story gained traction, lawyers representing both sides began negotiations. Sarah filed a formal complaint against the HOA officer for brandishing a firearm without justification, citing not only the danger posed to her, but also the broader issue of misuse of authority. The HOA, desperate to protect its image, hired a high-profile legal team to mitigate the damage. But even they couldn't deny the gravity of what had happened. Pointing a gun at someone over a minor parking infraction wasn't just poor judgment, it was reckless and unlawful. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters camped outside her house, hoping for an exclusive interview. Neighbors stopped her in the grocery store, eager to share their support, or in some cases, their criticisms of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. At first, Sarah tried to avoid the attention, wanting nothing more than to return to her normal life. But she soon realized that this moment gave her a platform, one she could use to make a difference. Sarah began speaking at community forums and town hall meetings, addressing issues of civil liberties and the dangers of unchecked power. She didn't focus solely on the HOA incident. Instead, she used it as a springboard to discuss broader topics like accountability, transparency, and respect for individual rights. Her military background lent credibility to her words, and her calm, measured delivery resonated with audiences. People listened, not because she was a celebrity overnight, but because her message was powerful and timely. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled to repair its tarnished reputation. They issued public apologies, promising reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. One of their first actions was suspending the private patrol service pending a full investigation into the officer's conduct. They also announced plans to revise their enforcement policies, emphasizing education and communication over punishment. Some residents applauded these changes, while others remained skeptical, believing the HOA was merely trying to save face. For Mark, watching his wife step into this new role was both inspiring and humbling. He'd always known how extraordinary Sarah was, but seeing her command respect on such a large scale filled him with pride. It also motivated him to get involved. Mark joined a newly formed neighborhood watch program, one focused on fostering safety through collaboration rather than intimidation. Together, he and Sarah became advocates for balance, encouraging their neighbors to take pride in their community without letting rules overshadow compassion. As the dust settled, the HOA board held another meeting to discuss long-term solutions. This time, Sarah attended not as a victim, but as a voice for change. When given the opportunity to speak, she addressed the room with the same poise and clarity that had disarmed the HOA officers weeks earlier. "Rules are important," she said, "but so is humanity. Let's work together to build a community where people feel valued, not policed. Her words left a lasting impression. While the HOA still existed to maintain order, its approach shifted significantly. Fines were replaced with warnings, disputes were resolved through dialogue, and neighborly kindness started to outweigh nitpicking. For Sarah and Mark, the ordeal had been exhausting, but it ultimately strengthened their resolve to stand up for justice, even if it meant challenging those who thought they held all the power. And though life in the neighborhood would never be perfect, it was undeniably better than before. Months after the infamous incident, life in the suburban neighborhood began to settle into a new rhythm. The HOA's once iron-fisted enforcement had softened considerably, thanks in large part to Sarah's intervention and the reforms that followed. Gone were the days of nitpicking over minor infractions like lawn ornaments or mailbox colors. Instead, the association focused on fostering goodwill and encouraging residents to take pride in their community without fear of punishment. It wasn't a perfect system. Some neighbors still grumbled about unresolved issues. But overall, the atmosphere felt lighter, more welcoming. For Sarah and Mark, things returned to a semblance of normalcy, though their lives had been forever changed by the events. Sarah continued balancing her dual roles as a devoted mother and an elite soldier, deploying periodically for missions while maintaining her presence at home. Her secret was no longer so secret. Word of her Delta Force status spread throughout the neighborhood, earning her a mix of admiration and cautious respect. Neighbors who once barely acknowledged her now greeted her warmly, some even seeking her advice on matters ranging from self-defense tips to conflict resolution. Mark, inspired by his wife's courage, threw himself into the revamped Neighborhood Watch program. What started as a small initiative grew into a thriving effort to promote safety through collaboration rather than control. He organized monthly meetings where residents could voice concerns, share ideas, and work together to address issues like speeding cars or stray animals. Under his leadership, the group became less about policing and more about building connections, a stark contrast to the old HOA patrol tactics. As for Mr. Harold Jenkins, the self-appointed enforcer whose complaint sparked the entire ordeal, he quietly faded from the spotlight. Embarrassed by the backlash and unable to face Sarah or other neighbors, he put his house on the market and moved away within weeks. Some speculated that he couldn't handle the shift in power dynamics, while others simply shrugged it off as karma catching up. Either way, his departure marked the end of an era, one defined by unnecessary tension and rigid rules. Sarah, too, found herself reflecting on the experience. While she hadn't sought out the attention or intended to become a local figurehead, she recognized the impact she'd made. Speaking at forums and advocating for change had reignited a passion in her, one that extended beyond her military service. She began mentoring young women interested in careers in defense and law enforcement, sharing stories of resilience and empowerment. Her message was simple yet powerful. Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. The HOA board, eager to move past the controversy, implemented several lasting changes. They created a mediation committee to handle disputes fairly and transparently, ensuring that conflicts wouldn't escalate unnecessarily. Fines were replaced with reminders, and warnings came with offers of assistance rather than threats. These adjustments not only improved relationships among residents, but also restored trust in the organization itself. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch watching the sunset, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was better, friendlier, kinder. Even the air seemed lighter, free from the weight of constant scrutiny. Mark joined her, handing over a glass of lemonade. "You know," he said with a grin, "I think we might actually enjoy living here now." Sarah smiled back, taking a sip of her drink. "It took some work," she admitted, "but sometimes you have to stand your ground to make things better." And as they sat there together, surrounded by the sounds of laughter drifting from nearby yards, it was clear that the Thompsons' quiet suburban life had transformed, not just for them, but for everyone around them.